everyone. I'm excited that you've joined me today. I'm excited to get into the Word and talk a little bit about some revelation that God has just been bringing me back to over and over again for the last 6 months or more. And it has to do with Numbers 13 and 14 in the Old Testament, and talking about the Israelites and when the 12 spies were sent to spy on the Promised Land and come back and give a report of what they saw and whether they thought that the Israelites would be able to take hold of that Promised Land. And so, maybe if you were in Sunday school as a kid, you heard the song 12 spies went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. Okay, if you're not familiar with that story, what happens is that God has promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites as their promised land after He's delivered them from Egypt and out of slavery at the hand of the Pharaoh. And so at one point the Lord commands Moses to send spies into Canaan to check it out. And so Moses sends in 12 men, and they spend, I think it's 40 days, exploring the land and spying on the land. And when they come back with that report, they're sharing that it's amazing. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. The promised land of God is beautiful. It has good soil. It takes 2 people to carry 1 cluster of grapes on a pole between them. It's huge. So it's just a fertile land. It's all that God has promised. But then if we look in verse 27, Numbers 13, verse 27, they gave Moses this account of the land. When we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey, here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there were of great size. We saw the Nephilim there," the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked like them to them." We looked the same to them. So what we see is these spies have come back, and they start with a truth. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's great. Okay, but the people are powerful. Their cities are fortified. And then Caleb jumps in. No, guys, we can take it. We can surely take this. And then they come in and they start exaggerating with what seems like the basic intent of just spreading fear. So they're going, now we've got, these descendants, now it turns into Nephilim, and they're huge, and they're just devouring people. The land devours the people. Okay, so they just start spreading fear. They start giving a bad report. And what do the people do? In Numbers 14, verse 1, it says, "That night all the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, 'If only we had died in Egypt or in the desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?' And they said to each other, 'We should just choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" A few verses down in verse 7, Joshua and Caleb say, "And said to the entire Israelite assembly, 'The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." So that sounds like a great encouragement. The people's response, though, was they started to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. Okay, so the people, when faced with this presentation of on the same land, they have a good report and they have a bad report. Now they have more bad reports, 5 times as many bad reports as they do good reports. And they start to align themselves with the bad reports. They start freaking out. They start saying it would have been better if God had just left us in Egypt. It would be better if we were just slaves rather than die by the sword. And when I read this, it just baffles my mind. Because these people, this is the same group that God delivered out of Egypt. He had sent plagues to the Egyptians. He parted the Red Sea for them to cross. He sent manna from heaven to feed them, water from a rock. Okay? And so because of a bunch of fearful exaggerations, they're ready to walk straight back into bondage. Like they're ready to choose a new leader, turn around, and go back to slavery. Not because of anything they've experienced on their own, by the way, just because of 10 men's reports. Fear-based reports. So Caleb and Joshua, they're encouraging them, guys, don't rebel. Don't be afraid. God will be with us. The Lord gets pretty frustrated. He's going to do a bunch of stuff, but in verse 20, we see that the Lord forgives them. But the Lord replied, "I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has ever treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb had a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it." So the Israelites disqualified themselves from the promised land, which is so sad. At one point, this was a while ago, I was praying for a friend, and God said to me, "I want you to tell her that she's going to be in a season where she's going to have good reports and bad reports, and she needs to start looking for and listening to the good reports and not aligning herself with the bad reports." And it was a really powerful word, I felt anyways, and it actually got me looking at this passage a lot more and asking for revelation from the Holy Spirit on it, because I just see that so much in our own lives, that battle between good reports and bad reports. And so when the spies come back from checking out their circumstances, they're giving bad reports and they're breeding fear. It made me think, who else does that? Who else takes my circumstances, twists them, and breeds fear? Well, it surely isn't God. God does not use fear to speak to his people. It is not what he sounds like. God is love, and it says perfect love casts out fear. So he can't actually speak to us through fear. That's just not how he sounds. They can't abide together. Who does speak through fear? The father of lies. The devil does. Okay, the enemy will always twist truth. Just like the spies did. They told the truth, they told who was there, but then they started to exaggerate it and twist it. And that's what the enemy does with our circumstances. He takes truths or half-truths and he starts to twist and exaggerate and push that thought of worst-case scenario into our minds until we are so full of fear that we're ready to walk back into bondage. There was 10 bad reports and 2 good. And often in our lives, it can feel that way. We can see so much bad. We can see so many bad circumstances happening in our own life or in the lives of our friends and family. And there's so much fear-based thinking, so much fear-based media. We feel like the fear is more valid than the good reports. Okay? But fear will always lead us back into bondage. Always. It causes us to forget or discount everything that we've seen God do. And so just like the Israelites, because of the fear, again, it wasn't something that they actually witnessed on their own. It was just these fearful reports that they were ready to walk back into bondage. They were ready to go back, and they would see reminders of all God had done and walk themselves back into slavery. They wanted to elect a new leader. They wanted to stone the people who gave good reports. Now, I think it's important that we don't get too hard on the Israelites. It's easy to read this as an outsider and look at everything that God had done for them and how faithful He had been, and to think it's completely ridiculous that they would choose to not trust God and be ready to go back into slavery. But if we look at our own lives, I wonder how often we actually do the same thing. I know if I look at my own heart, I know that there are times when I have agreed with fear and I have followed it right back into my own bondage. And so just because we're comfortable there doesn't mean that we're free. We're limiting our lives to fear. It's, as a simple example, if you take the fear of flying. If I were to never get into a plane, I might feel very safe and comfortable on the ground, but I'm not actually free. I've just limited myself to the fear, and so it kind of gets off scot-free in that way. Now, the Israelites were led back to bondage, or they had the choice. They were choosing to go back to bondage, and it disqualified them from the promise. In our own lives, how are we supposed to enter into God's promises? How are we supposed to stand on His promises if we've turned around and are headed in the opposite direction? So we really need to be watching, on alert, and looking for good reports. We need to align ourselves with those and not the exaggerated fear-based reports. Part of that is believing in the goodness of God. Do you recognize that after all that the Israelites had seen God do, and we listed them earlier, and not all of them, that they still didn't trust Him? They still thought He had brought them there to die. Do we see God like that? I know that I have when I'm listening to fear, that I start to doubt the goodness of God. But God is good, and He is perfect love. And so we need to be able to trust and to rest in His promises. And that's going to come by faith, because we're not always going to feel that trust initially. Because sometimes when the circumstances are all around us and we have those fear-based reports coming at us, those feel really real and they feel really valid and justifiable. But He is perfect love, and we have to grab a hold of His promises by faith. So what does that look like in the practical? First thing is we need to start recognizing bad reports and calling them for what they are. They're lies, they're half-truths, they're fear-based. Okay, we see those things coming at us. We need to start recognizing them and being like, nope, that's a bad report. I'm actually not going to give it any attention. Then we need to start setting our mind on the goodness of God. We need to remember what He has done in our own lives. We need to start counting the things that God has done, where He has proved faithful, the miracles that we've seen in our own lives. Every time that God has showed up for us when we thought all was lost, we need to fill up on the testimonies of others, because when we see what God is doing, it builds up our faith. We are not only just hearing about His goodness, we're experiencing His goodness and experiencing that through others. And so we need to fill up on testimonies, which means you're probably going to have to get around people to hear their testimonies. Then we need to acknowledge and grab hold of good reports, no matter how seemingly small or insignificant they are. I find it interesting in the last verse of chapter 13, it said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." But those grasshoppers had the dunamis power of the living God behind them. So those good reports, it's important to see them as having that power of God behind them, because it might be a good day in the midst of a crazy circumstance. It might be a heart shift in someone that you didn't think was going to be able to shift. We need to start grabbing a hold and agreeing with those good reports. And we need to start celebrating those good reports and turning them into worship and praise, because that is such a powerful weapon. And lastly, we need to start speaking that agreement with those good reports and become someone who spreads those good reports, just like Joshua and Caleb did. They believed the good report, they saw it with their own eyes, they trusted in faith in the goodness of God, and then they spread that good report to others, and they brought encouragement to others. They said, don't be afraid, don't rebel, God is with us. The people in that land, their protection is gone, but God goes with us. So let's become people who spread good reports. So glad you listened today. I hope that can be an encouragement to you, and I just really challenge you to start looking for those good reports and coming into agreement with them. And if you have good reports, we'd love to hear them, so shoot us a message or comment on the video.